There's a mic here. You're invited up to ask. Please first identify yourself, and I would ask you keep your introduction to your question relatively brief. We're not looking for another keynote address here. So David, kick it off.
That was great, Craig. Thanks so much. My name is David Coletto from Abacus Data. Question on influencers. We hear about the Firefly documentary on Netflix. If you haven't seen it, it's interesting to examine the power of social media. When it comes to disinformation, how important are individuals at being able to spread that stuff, and how do you find out who they are?
Yeah, the short answer is they can be very important in that. So you have people who sort of build up a brand, whether it's on Instagram or Facebook or what have you, and they have a following. And what we see typically happening is they start to build a community and become part of a community with other people who are running websites or other influencers or what have you. And so they typically, form networks where the same content will appear across them within a short amount of time. And so they can be very influential. For one reason, very simply, like there's a human connection there compared to a sort of faceless Facebook page, which you may know the brand, but compare that with somebody who over time has, shared things about their life, has built up a following, has the same views as you. There's a stronger connection that people have with that. And so, in terms of finding them, you can, one thing that I would recommend if you want like another tool that's very easy to figure out that kind of thing is there's a tool called CrowdTangle owned by Facebook, and they have a wonderful browser extension. And if you are on a website and you want to know what Facebook pages and Twitter accounts have shared that website, you can click on that and it's going to show you. And so we've been using that to absolutely identify some Canadians who have Facebook pages who are starting to really kind of get really more influential as the election is approaching, building their brand as an influencer, whether it's on the right or the left, to push stuff out there. And so, influencers are a big focus in the marketing world right now. Like rather than necessarily paying for a generic ad, they pay for somebody who's really popular on Instagram to use their product and talk about it. And we see a similar thing happening in the political arena where somebody who's running a website realizes that they have an ideological alignment with someone who's really big on Facebook or on Instagram, and they may pay them to share their content. They may share ad revenue that comes as a result of it, or they just may have that shared ideology and decide, yes, we want to work together. And so it's absolutely a factor in politics.
Craig, you mentioned people on the right or the left. We often associate, I think, the misinformation, the disinformation campaigns with the right. Speak a little bit about, do you see it from the other side of the political spectrum?
You do. So the best example of that is, you think about 8 years of Obama. Yes, there was tons of crazy false stuff being pushed about him. Trump gets elected, massive increase in liberal misinformation. There's no question about that. And part of the reason is, you suddenly have this enemy. You have this person that is building up so much animosity and is such a public focus that people begin to be willing to believe a lot of different things. And I would say in the Canadian example, leading up to the 2015 election, a lot of the animosity and the stuff that you would see out there was about Stephen Harper, because he'd been in power for close to a decade, right? And so that goes to the human bias thing. Yes, we're all susceptible. I think we end up talking about more right-leaning stuff for one of the reasons is that for a long time, conservatives have felt like mainstream media does not represent them in their views. And so they have over time decided to just kind of, yes, some participate in mainstream media and what have you, but they've also developed their own media ecosystem. And there's a lot of very good conservative outlets and really good conservative reporters. There's also a lot of folks who've gone into that area who don't really care about journalistic ethics. And so because it's been kind of disconnected from mainstream journalism, there's been a bit more of a market for it there. But I always do emphasize, like at the end of the day, we all have our vulnerabilities. And the last thing is, for our election in Canada, Trudeau is naturally the target. He's the incumbent. But not only that, he's also the global symbol of being a liberal for a lot of people. And so not only is he a target in Canada, but he's also internationally a target. And Canada has also got issues now with Russia and China and Saudi Arabia, which is maybe not the best scenario to be in leading into election if you're worried about foreign interference. So yeah, I think we're all susceptible, but there are some differences depending on the environment.
Very good.
Sorry, my name is Shahad, and I am interested in the piece that you talked about regarding microchips. So there's a lot of racist trolling, and there's a lot of just racist misinformation being perpetuated. So just the other day, Facebook took out a bunch of accounts, and so all over the CBC, we have these people being interviewed, right, and how they feel about it. And we also have politicians co-signing a lot of the stuff that are being said, mostly on the right side of the political spectrum. So when it comes to journalistic ethics and standards, this is obviously an ongoing discussion, but what are your tips on maybe deciding, or what is your moral guide on deciding whether a racist deserves a platform?
Yeah. I mean, so this is one of the things that I think a lot of newsrooms struggle with. So the first thing is to realize that they'll take the hit to get the smaller win. So you think you're putting a racist on TV or whatever to show people that they're a racist, but when you use weasel words and don't actually call them a racist, one, you're giving them more of a platform. But two, like I said, if 90% of people or more people are disgusted by them, they don't care. They want to take that whatever percentage who are interested in it. So I think in the case of the Facebook thing, Facebook has decided that white nationalist and white supremacist content is extremist content, which it is, and they're removing it, and they're not giving them a place on their platform. And so I guess for me, the question for a newsroom is if Facebook has decided they don't deserve a place on its platform, if these ideologies have led to mass murder, why are you giving it a platform on your airwaves? There's the both sides piece of it doesn't make sense in those scenarios. I mean, are you going to put ISIS on and necessarily treat them like a legitimate point of view? And so I think that that's a really key thing for newsrooms. And so, for us, like I think, one, if you're going to put somebody on there, are you putting them on in a context where you're describing accurately what they are and the dangers of that ideology? Are you putting them on in a context where they're not just being free, they're not allowed to freely say whatever they want to kind of convert people? And the other thing that I would say that is absolutely a bedrock thing is like, do not promote their Facebook page and their Twitter account and show like, here is the Facebook page this guy runs and he's a white nationalist. It's like, that is the recruitment thing that they're aiming for. And so, I mean, hopefully those are a few tips there, but it's like, I think it is a difficult thing for newsrooms because there are legitimate concerns about suppressing free speech as platforms crack down. That's a big thing, but I don't think that violent extremists really fit into that category.
Ed?
Hi, Craig. That was great. Ed Greenspan, Public Policy Forum. I wonder just your comments about WhatsApp. So as people who might be willfully trying to mislead others go into closed environments like that, harder for you to track, for people who want to track it. But doesn't it become also harder for them to propagate and recruit? They can talk among themselves, but don't they have to pop up? And are they having are you seeing a double existence, if you will?
There is that element. There's the element where it's great for planning, right? It's great for doing stuff out of the public view. But when you get in a scenario like India or Brazil, where these are kind of default communications platforms, it really does enable it to spread very quickly. And the other thing that's really concerning about these platforms, even though they're not public, and that does blunt some of it, the fact that they're not public and the fact that it's typically people spreading stuff to other people that they know personally or who they're closely ideologically aligned with, that actually makes other people more inclined to share and to believe the stuff because there's a close social tie there, there's a personal knowledge or a familial connection. And so, yeah, you've got a bit of an advantage in that because I can't find it, it's also not just out there publicly for people, but the disadvantage is that it creates this perception of community that actually makes people more inclined to share, to spread, to believe the stuff that they're seeing. So, you can win on one area and lose on another is kind of the way I think it plays out.
Hi, thanks for the talk. I'm Liz Gray from the Canadian Internet Policy and Public Interest Clinic at Ottawa. A lot of the things you propose as responses and solutions, they're very bottom-up individual skepticism. Do you think there's a role for top-down solutions, regulation, legal approaches?
So I have a bias that I'm not a big fan of potentially new legislation in this area. And there's a couple reasons for that. One is I think there are lawmakers who are well educated on this stuff, but I don't think they're the majority, and I'm just worried about really bad laws being passed in haste. Because the downside of that is suppression of free speech, The stop of the growth of the internet potentially as well. We still have a access problem in Canada. Rural and Indigenous communities do not have the access that other people do. And so I'm a bit hesitant. I admit my bias on that. And I think we've seen examples of really bad laws being passed in other countries. Like Germany has done a bunch of things, some of them very helpful, but they've also passed some laws that have been very difficult and didn't really have the intended effect. And we've, of course, seen really repressive governments pass really, really bad laws that basically criminalize any kind of opposition. So what I am a fan of is governments threatening legislation. I think that's extremely effective, and they need to back it up to a certain extent. But I mean, the Canadian government, I think, is putting a lot of pressure on Facebook right now, and I think it's making Facebook do some things they wouldn't otherwise be doing. That doesn't mean I think that lawmakers should completely, walk away from this, but I think finding ways for them to be engaged, for them to be cautious about the potential, downsides of a new law, but also being engaged enough that they're forcing better behavior and trying to shape that. Like, I think all of those things are good things, but I don't know what a really good solution looks like on the legislation side. It's certainly not my expertise.
What about a committee of bureaucrats who are going to be vetting content and presumably naming and shaming at the very least?
Well, so I think the Election Canada stuff around election integrity, them interacting with the parties, trying to push them to have better practices around cybersecurity and all that, I think that's good. I think a government, calling out stuff, I think that's a very problematic position for them to be in, just like I think it's problematic for them to decide who's a real news organization to receive funding or not, but that's a sidetrack, I won't get into that. So it's problematic because of the source of it. And there are also times where for journalists, where we're calling stuff out, and I know there are people who, because it's published on BuzzFeed, they're going to choose not to believe it right out of the gate, regardless of whatever effort we make to show our work. But I think for government, it's an even more difficult thing. And it's a scenario where that's just like, it is such an easy target for the people creating and spreading this stuff to say, see, they're trying to censor everybody, see, it's like, government mind control. And that's, over time, that's going to be an effective counter message for them.
Very good. Christian.
My name's Christian Pauslang. I'm a Master's of Journalism student here at Carleton. You talked about how journalists can become targets for trolls and for spreaders of misinformation to try to get you to repeat the message. I was wondering if you could talk about what is the best practice for if news organizations or journalists on Twitter or on Facebook are actually taken in by fake news and spread it unwittingly, not in their coverage, but they actually fall for it. Used to be you'd publish a correction in a newspaper or something like that, but now do you delete it? Do you append an editor's note? I was wondering what you thought about that.
So if we're talking specifically about a social platform where you've spread something, you realize, oh crap, I've really stepped in it now. What I think is the best practice these days for that is, let's say it's a tweet. You should delete the tweet, but before you delete it, you should screenshot it. And then you take the screenshot and you send a new tweet. And if you were threading, you need to add this to your thread. And then I think also tweet it separately. And then you put the screenshot on your tweet and say, I have deleted this tweet because. And you explain why. You apologize, always a good human thing to do, right? And so you're not trying to disappear your mistake. The worst thing is to just delete your tweet and sort of walk away like, oh, hopefully nobody noticed. You need to own the error, and you need to show what was in there before. And so I think that's really important. And one of the things that we do a lot is, like, we have badges that say false or misleading or whatever, and we'll put badges on tweets or things like that. And so if I was to do that myself, like, I might put a badge on it so that somebody else doesn't take my screenshot and then start spreading it to, smear me with it. It's got false on it or what have you. I mean, they'll still do that, but at least you might mitigate it a bit. So deleting and then acknowledging, I think, are good best practices. And if it's on a website, absolutely, adding a correction and not just deleting the page is really, really important. Because if you delete the page, then the people who link to it and send people to it, they go to an error page and they don't know why it's gone. So absolutely, that ethic of correction still applies. And acknowledging it and being open and transparent about it, you're going to feel horrible. People are going to make fun of you, but it's a lot worse if you actually try to disappear it.
Hi, my name is Danielle. I'm with Apathy is Boring, and we are the official Youth Get Out to Vote organization for youth age 18 to 30. And we've currently been contracted to draft or put together actually a media literacy campaign for our target audience, 18 to 30. Considering,
You just got one.
considering youth 18 to 30, there's a lot of different profiles that fit under there. So some are more engaged, some are less engaged. Our challenge right now with Ogilvy Canada, who we're working with for this campaign, is kind of filtering all the information that you provided into a condensed, accessible way, because I think a lot of this applies to journalists, but how do we actually inform youth that are a lot, less engaged, how to pay attention to these issues?
I think the first thing that seems to be a lesson from a lot of other initiatives is if you call it media literacy or digital literacy, people start to just pass out, right? And so thinking about how it's framed and how it's described, I think is really important. I mean, I'll give you an example. It's like for every age group, but I was talking to somebody, actually a guy who used to make a living from fake news. He's now retired, thankfully. But he was telling me how in his town in California, the local senior center had a workshop called Tips for Spotting Fake News. And I think every age group needs it, by the way. And he said nobody showed up because every single person thinks, well, I know how to spot fake news. I'm not going to fall for that. And that's true for everybody. And so it's the same thing for folks who are, who use the internet and use cell phones and whatnot a lot. Like the idea that they need to be taught something is maybe not going to appeal to them. So I think thinking about that framing piece is important. The other part is where are they and how do you reach them? What platforms are they on and how can you reach them there where they're already at rather than trying to pull them into an event somewhere or this or that. Figuring out how you map those things to them is important. And I mean, as a starting point for me, rather than necessarily teaching people a specific tool or what have you, it's almost helping people understand how different this media environment is today. And the stuff that they're using and interacting with every day, how the decisions are made of what they're seeing and what they're engaging with, whether it's algorithms or because their friends have done something. For me, that's always the starting point when I talk about those things because that relates to their daily experience, but pulls back the veil a little bit of here's why that works that way. And then gets into, here's all the different actors trying to spread different things. So, I mean, those are sort of general thoughts. There's an organization called Civics in Canada. Yeah. So they've developed a whole program, and it's aimed at teaching the teachers to go and teach students who are younger than your target group. But if you haven't interacted with them, you have. Okay, so I think they've spoken to a lot of great experts in the area, and I think that they've been able to synthesize a lot of good tips, even better than I could offer. So I would say, that's a good place in Canada to team up with more.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi, I'm Lise Patterson. You offered an important word of caution, both to journalists and to media consumers, about the role of cognitive biases and the way it corrupts the way we perceive the information out there. And given that we humans are indeed too quick to reach for the narratives and facts that fit into our cherished views, do you have any quick and dirty practical tactics you would recommend to rein in these cognitive demons, or is that just best left for another lecture?
I think there are some simple things. So the first one is a lot of times this material is trying to get an emotional reaction out of you. And so trying to kind of cultivate this self-recognition of, I just read something, it really made me angry. And think about, well, why? And where is this coming from? And why did I get that reaction? And just starting to have that, just cultivate that sort of self-awareness around the effect that media you're consuming is having on you, and starting to recognize those feelings and those emotions. I know I sound like a psychotherapist right now, but it's this is it. If you start to recognize that, then that becomes a really good thing for you to step aside and say, okay, so wait, what is this? And then the second thing is, I think it's a really great exercise to go and read content from reliable sources, but that come from a very different point of view from yours. And again, to recognize what your reaction is to it. If you have a very specific point of view on a topic, and you see an article from a credible source that's coming from a different point of view, read it, and then pay attention to the things that get that emotional reaction, to the things you're instantly dismissing, because you're starting to recognize your own patterns in that way. And I think just like practicing those things, that it really is something you have to practice. It's like a behavioral thing. It becomes really interesting. Even if you're not necessarily going to change your mind on stuff, that's fine, but you start to recognize these natural reactions that happen.
Very good. Thank you very much. And the final question for the session.
Craig, excellent talk. Thank you very much. My name is Lawrence Wall from the CBC. We've seen a lot of anti-liberal, anti-Trudeau social media content, not so much with the other side, the other parties. Typical journalist question, leading up for the next 7 months to the campaign, what kind of misinformation, disinformation campaign would you expect will be mounted?
So I think you're right that, and for the reason I sort of talked about earlier, it's the anti-Trudeau stuff that is most prevalent. He's the incumbent. He's a big symbol. All of those things make sense. So I think we'll see people trying to. I mean, there's a current scandal going on. I think we'll see people trying to sort of shape the view of that over time. Even though there's a recording that came out last night, the way that that's framed is a really big thing, and so I think we'll see people using raw material like that and existing scandals and things to spread stuff. There is a very strong. I mean, one of the things that I'm seeing already is one, there's a lot of Islamophobic and anti-Muslim sentiment. I mean, I think that is absolutely going to be a theme because it gets wrapped around immigration. Immigration and refugees are going to be big topics. I think those are going to be huge vectors for disinformation and misinformation. One of the things that I'm already seeing a lot are people talking about whether we should have cabinet ministers in Canada that weren't born in Canada, whether we should have Muslim cabinet ministers. I mean, this is stuff that is already kind of spreading and getting out there. So those are areas. Stuff around the environment, climate change, we'll probably see a lot around that and the carbon tax. And especially if things change with Keystone. I know the U.S. just took a step around that. So those are all some of the topics that I would see. But the other piece is the stuff you can't really prepare for, which is an event happens on the campaign trail, and people are going to seek to shape that. And so there's that element of the kind of rapid response, or an event happens in a community. Whether it's a violent event or something like that, you're going to see people start to shape that within the frames of the election. So I think things around immigration, the things that are already the big topics, like those are the places where people's hearts and minds are probably going to be swayed over the election. That's where you're going to see these kinds of things happening. I'm curious to see, frankly, so we had a story with the Toronto Star just, was it yesterday? No, it was 2 nights ago, it went online, where we had sources in Canadian intelligence telling us that they've already seen the baseline of cyber attacks rising. And they believe that that's going to continue as we get closer to the election. So if material is being stolen or it's already been stolen, how is that potentially going to be leaked and weaponized? And then that becomes a big decision for newsrooms of, how do you cover potentially newsworthy information, but that has come from potentially, criminal or foreign sources. And so that's a piece that I can't predict what will happen, but I think that's something that if I was thinking in a newsroom, like gaming through that process of a leak or something like that is probably a good conversation to have.
Very difficult challenge for the newsrooms is to question the motivation of people who are leaking us things, because we all know that people leak us things for their own interests. And so coming to terms with how we use that information is always challenging, and will be even more so as different people obtain it in different ways.
Yeah,
So,
there's always the operations, the opposition research who feed stuff off into media, but we have other entities acting in that now.
Right.
Yeah.
all right, Craig. Well, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
For
Thanks for
coming.
your questions. I appreciate it.
So we'll have a break now for coffee, and then we'll be back here with Joyce Napier and her panel.